What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be going through my top 36 wide receivers as we head into week 5 of the NFL season. Later today, we're going to have the running backs as well, so make sure you are subscribed to this channel. That way you don't miss that video when it comes out. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these wide receivers. All right, so as you can see, I have the tier maker pulled up on the screen as we speak. I have 7 tiers to get through all 36 guys in today's episode, so we will be kicking it off in my tier 1. My tier 1 is the elite wide receiver ones here in week 5. Coming in at number 1, I got Jamar Chase. He's playing against the Baltimore Ravens this week, and he has recorded 3 catches on 6 targets for 85 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's game against the Carolina Panthers. Now, Chase, he has started to find his rhythm here in the football season. He scored 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games, and he's going to look to keep it up in a very high-scoring matchup against the Ravens in a game that has a 50.5-point game total here in this week. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 2, this is where I'm going to put CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. He gets to play a game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Last week, Lamb, he secured 7 of 8 targets for 98 yards and a touchdown, and he rushed 3 times for 8 yards as well in the Cowboys' 20-15 win over the Giants on Thursday Night Football. This week's matchup against Pittsburgh, it's going to be a lot tougher than the matchup that he saw there against the Giants, but I do think he's still one of the top plays at the position, so you can't fade him. He comes in as my number 2. Now, coming in at number 3 for me, this is where I'm going to put Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. He plays against the Buffalo Bills, and Collins, he caught 12 of 15 targets for 151 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 24-20 win over the Jaguars. Nico, he's coming off of his best game of this year so far. Now he has 2 top 5 performances in his last 3 games, and he's going to look to continue adding that here against a tough Buffalo Bills defense that ranks currently first against the wide receiver position, so it is a tough matchup, but still a top 3 play for me. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 4, this is where I'm going to put Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. He gets to play a game in London this week against the New York Jets. Last week, Jefferson, he secured 6 of 8 targets for 85 yards and a touchdown in the Vikings' 31-29 win over the Packers on Sunday. He has been very consistent so far this year. He's found the end zone in each and every game of the season so far, and however, I do think that this week's is going to be a much tougher matchup because he is going to be shadowed by Sauce Gardner for the majority of the game. I do think Jefferson is still matchup proof and still a wide receiver 1 for fantasy football purposes. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 5, this is where I'm going to put Malik Nabers, and he is the last player in this elite tier. He gets to play a game at the Seattle Seahawks, and Nabers, he caught 12 of 15 targets for 115 yards in Thursday's 15-20 loss to the Cowboys. He did suffer a concussion in the 4th quarter. It did force him to miss the remainder of the game, but he had a long break. He is most likely going to be playing this week, so I am operating as if he is on the field. That being said, he is still one of the elite wide receivers in fantasy football, and if he is good to go, he is a must-start top 5 play at the position. Now, moving on to my tier 2 of wide receivers, this is what we're going to call high-end wide receiver 1s, and coming in at number 6, I got DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. He gets to play against the New York Giants this week. Last week, Metcalf, he had 7 receptions on 12 targets for 104 yards, and he lost a fumble in that Monday night loss to the Lions. Metcalf, he was tackled on the 1-yard line that led to a Kenneth Walker touchdown in this one, so he could have had a much bigger game than he actually came away with, but he's on a hot streak. This new Seattle offense looks good, and he's still a top play at the wide receiver position. Now, coming in for me as wide receiver 7, this is where I'm going to have Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. He plays on the road at the San Francisco 49ers, and last week Harrison caught 5 of 6 targets for 45 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 42-14 loss to the Commanders. Marvin didn't really have the big game that we expected against the Washington Commanders. They have been giving wide receiver weeks like crazy to all of these wide receivers because they've just been bleeding a ton of fantasy football points. However, this week versus San Francisco, it is projected to be another high-scoring matchup, so there is going to be plenty of opportunities for a guy like Marvin Harrison to bounce back. And the last player here in this tier 2 for me is going to actually be number 8, Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed, he plays for the Green Bay Packers and is on the road against the Los Angeles Rams. He secured 7 of 8 targets for 139 yards and a touchdown, and he rushed 1 time for 2 yards in the Packers' 31-29 loss to the Vikings on Sunday. Jayden Reed, he's finished as the wide receiver 1 overall in week 1 and the wide receiver 2 overall in week 4. Both of these games, Jordan Love was under center, and this week's matchup against the Rams, it's very nice for Reed, and he is a must-start wide receiver here in week 5. Now, moving on to my tier 3 here. Tier 3 is where I'm going to have these low-end wide receiver 1s, and Chris Godwin comes in as my number 9. He secured 6 of 9 targets for 69 yards in the Buccaneers' 33-16 win over the Eagles on Sunday. He's kind of cooled off a little bit from his hot start where he had 2 top 12 finishes in weeks 1 and week 2. Last week, it was the first time that he finished outside of the top 30, but it was also his first game this season without scoring a touchdown. I think he has a safe floor in this offense due to the target volume that he's seeing, and he's still a player that I think we can rely on as a wide receiver 1. Now, coming in at number 10, this is where I'm going to put his teammate Mike Evans. Again, they play against the Atlanta Falcons in this one. Now, Evans, he secured 8 of 14 targets for 94 yards and a touchdown in the Buccaneers' 33-16 win over the Eagles on Sunday. Evans, he's kind of been this boom-bust wide receiver so far this year, having his boom weeks when he does find the end zone. That said, he's still come down with 3 of his 5 red zone targets through 4 weeks, so he is seeing some consistent looks there in the end zone. Now, coming in at my wide receiver 11, this is where I'm going to put Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. He gets to play against that Washington Commanders defense that I said is bleeding a ton of points to the wide receiver position. Last week, Cooper, he had 4 receptions on 8 targets for 35 yards in Sunday's 20-16 loss to the Las Vegas Raiders. It's worth noting that Amari Cooper, he had a very long touchdown called back in this one. It would have made the week look completely different than it actually looked on the box score. But so far this year, this is the matchup that we want for wide receivers in Washington, and this is exactly what Amari Cooper is going to get here in week 5. So he's a player that I'm very high on this week. Now, the last player in this tier for me to round out the wide receiver ones, I do have Deebo Samuel coming in as my wide receiver 12. They play against the Arizona Cardinals this week, and Samuel, he finished with 3 receptions on 5 targets for 58 yards and 14 rushing yards in his 2 attempts on Sunday's 30-13 win over the Patriots. Deebo, he missed week 3 with an injury and maybe came back a week too early because he didn't look that good in week 4, but a matchup with Arizona should be a good one for Deebo, who is due for a bounce back game here this week. Now let's move on to my tier 4. My tier 4 is going to be those high-end wide receiver 2s. Coming in at wide receiver 13, I have Drake London. He gets to play against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week, and last week London caught 6 of 12 targets for 64 yards in Sunday's 26-24 win over the New Orleans Saints. London, he now has exactly 6 catches in each of his last 3 games, and he has found the end zone in 2 of those 3 games as well. The way it's been going, if he falls into the end zone, we can expect a good week. If not, he's going to disappoint. That's kind of just what it's been with Drake London so far, but he still comes in for me as a wide receiver 2 this week. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 14 on the week, I do have Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. He gets to play on the road at the Kansas City Chiefs. Last week, Olave, he caught 8 of 10 targets for 87 yards in Sunday's 26-24 loss to the Falcons. He gets a matchup this week against the Chiefs. As I mentioned, they currently rank 12th against the wide receiver position, and the game has a mediocre game total of about 42.5 points. I'd say he is a good, not great type of play here in week 5, but he does have some upside if he can find his way into the end zone. Now, coming in for me as my wide receiver 15, here's where I'm going to put Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. As I mentioned, they play the Minnesota Vikings. This is across the pond over there in London. Last week, Wilson, he got 5 of 8 targets for 41 yards, and he lost a fumble in Sunday's 10-9 loss to the Denver Broncos. We knew it was going to be a tough matchup for Garrett Wilson, who still has yet to crack the top 24 wide receivers in any week so far this year. He gets a matchup in London this week against the chaotic Vikings defense, but Wilson, he could potentially bounce back in this one because Minnesota's lone weak spot so far this year has been to fantasy football wide receivers. So a good opportunity for Garrett Wilson to potentially bounce back here in week 5. Now, coming in for me as my wide receiver 16, here's where I'm going to put Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. As I mentioned, they play Arizona. Aiyuk, he had 2 receptions on 5 targets for 48 yards in last week's win against the Patriots. Aiyuk, he's yet to give us this big game this year, despite seeing 5 red zone targets and a 20.7% target share through the first month of the season. So it's now or never for me for Brandon Aiyuk, who does get to go against this Cardinals defense that currently ranks 18th against the wide receiver position, and they have a very high projected game total at 50.5 projected points. Now, moving on to number 17, this is where I'm going to put Stefon Diggs of the Houston Texans. He gets to play a game against the Buffalo Bills. Can you say revenge game? Diggs caught 5 of 9 targets for 69 yards, and he took his only carry for a 6-yard touchdown in Sunday's 24-20 win over the Jacksonville Jaguars. That said, Diggs, he's been a top 20 wide receiver in 3 of his last 4 games as a Texan, and he gets a matchup here this week against Buffalo. As I mentioned, they are a very tough matchup. They're number 1 against wide receivers at the moment, but this is going to be a very fun narrative for us to follow as we head into the weekend. And now the last player in this tier for me, coming in at number 18, I got Diontae Johnson of the Carolina Panthers. He plays on the road at the Chicago Bears. Johnson, he caught 7 of his 13 targets for 83 yards and 1 touchdown in Sunday's 34-24 loss to the Bengals. With Andy Dalton under center, Diontae Johnson has finished as a top 10 play at the wide receiver position in both of those weeks. However, this week's matchup against Chicago, it is much tougher than the last 2 matchups that he's had. We can still play him, though, as a wide receiver 2 here in week 5. Now, moving on to my tier 5. Tier 5 is what we're going to call low-end wide receiver 2s. Coming in at number 19, I'm going to put DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. They play the Carolina Panthers, and on Sunday, Moore, he secured 3 of 6 targets for 22 yards and a touchdown in the Bears' 24-18 win over the Rams. Kind of a disappointing day for DJ Moore. We had him as the start of the week. That actually didn't pan out. That said, though, the touchdown catch from Moore, it was good enough to sneak him in as a wide receiver 3 overall on the week. Not the wide receiver 3, but a wide receiver 3. Keep that in mind. But week 5 against Carolina should be a good matchup on paper, and he gets the revenge game narrative as well, kind of similar to Stefon Diggs. So we get to see DJ Moore against the Panthers. Now, moving on to my number 20 wide receiver on the week, I got George Pickens. George Pickens, he gets to play against the Dallas Cowboys. He recorded 7 receptions on 11 targets for 113 yards in Sunday's 27-24 loss to the Colts. We've been saying it for weeks that we need Justin Fields to take a step forward if George Pickens is going to rise to the occasion, and it looks like they both did a little bit at least last week. Dallas has been pretty middle of the pack against wide receivers so far this year, so Pickens' performance will again depend on Fields elevating this offense, but this is a solid opponent to try and do that too. So George Pickens comes in for me as my 20th overall wide receiver. Now moving on to 21, this is where we're going to put Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. He gets to play on the road at the New England Patriots. He secured 4 of 7 targets for 23 yards, and he rushed 3 times for 19 yards in the Dolphins' 31-12 loss to the Titans on Monday night. And not only has Tyreek Hill's production been significantly compromised by the quarterback play, but Tyreek also had a meltdown on the sideline in this game. He was yelling, he was screaming. Mike McDaniel looked really overwhelmed. It was not a good scene. That said, he gets a tough matchup this week against Christian Gonzalez. It's going to be another game of Tyler Huntley or Skylar Thompson, so you know what that means for Tyreek Hill in this Miami offense. Probably not good things. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 22 on the week, I'm going to put Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. They play against the Cincinnati Bengals on the road. Flowers, he brought in 2 targets for 10 yards in Sunday's 35-10 win over the Bills. This Ravens offense, it seems to have shifted gears pretty heavily over the last 2 weeks. In the first 2 weeks of the season, Flowers, he saw 21 targets. Over the last 2 weeks, he's seen 6 targets. It's not ideal. That's not the trend that you want to see, but he comes in for me this week as my wide receiver 22. It's just going to be hard for me to trust any of the pass catchers in this Ravens offense at the current moment. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 23, here's where I'm going to put Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. They play against the Cleveland Browns. McLaurin, he caught 7 of 10 targets for 52 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 42-14 win over the Cardinals. The Washington Commanders offense, it's rolling at the moment. They've scored 80 points in their last 2 games. Yes, 80 points from this Commanders offense in the last 2 games. They get a matchup with Cleveland this week, but the way they've been playing means that we should be playing Commanders options in fantasy football. And now the last player in this tier for me, it is going to be my wide receiver 24. We are going to have T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. They play against the Baltimore Ravens, as I mentioned. But Higgins, he recorded 6 receptions on 10 targets for 60 yards in Sunday's 34-24 win over the Panthers. Higgins, he looks to slowly be working his way back into the offense after missing the first 2 games of the year due to injury. But last week's double-digit targets, those are a good sign of some good things to potentially come here for T. Higgins. So let's move on to my tier 6. Tier 6, we're going to call high-end wide receiver 3s. And coming in at wide receiver 25, I got Jackson Smith-Njigba. He plays against the New York Giants, and Smith-Njigba, he finished with 8 catches off of 12 targets for 51 yards in Monday's 42-29 loss to the Detroit Lions. The lack of production makes JSN's performance feel a little bit underwhelming, but the fact that he garnered double-digit targets twice in Seattle's last 3 contests bodes well for his rest of season projections. I think he's a decent play here based on the volume alone in Week 5 versus the New York Giants. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 26, here's where I'm going to put Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. They get to play against the Indianapolis Colts, and Thomas, he caught 6 of 9 targets for 86 yards and a touchdown and added 13 rushing yards on 1 carry in Sunday's 24-20 loss to the Texans. A sneaky top 10 finish last week for BTJ in Week 4. Doug Peterson, he's doubled down. He said that he wants to get him more footballs or at least throw a couple more his way. I think this matchup against Indy, it's going to be great for Ryan Thomas Jr., and he should be in your starting lineups here this week. Now, moving on to my wide receiver 27, I'm going to put Khalil Shakir for the Buffalo Bills. They play against the Houston Texans on the road. Shakir, he caught 4 of 5 targets for 62 yards in Sunday's 35-10 loss to the Ravens. Shakir, he has been quite good for fantasy football teams to start the year, but in Week 4, he got a tough matchup versus the Ravens, and he picked up an ankle injury in that one. If he can go this week, which it does seem like he is going to be going, he should be a solid matchup against the soft Texans secondary, and they currently rank 25th against opposing wide receivers. Now, coming in as my wide receiver 28, here's where I'm going to put Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. Like I mentioned, this game is in London. Addison, he returned from a 2-game absence due to that ankle injury. He brought in 3 of his 4 targets for 72 yards and a touchdown. He also recorded a 7-yard score on his only rushing attempt of the day for the Vikings in that 31-29 win over the Packers on Sunday. Addison is going to continue to perform on one of the best passing offenses in the NFL, and with Jefferson likely seeing a ton of Sauce Gardner on Sunday, Minnesota may need to lean on Jordan Addison a little bit more in this one. Now moving on to my wide receiver 29, here's where I'm going to put Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts. He gets a really good matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and last week Pittman, he recorded 6 receptions on 9 targets for 113 yards in Sunday's 27-24 win over the Steelers. Now Pittman, he did show signs of life in week 4, but that was only because Joe Flacco was under center, and he elevated the entire passing offense for Indianapolis, and it's tough to rank Pittman now because we don't really know who's going to be under center. I am operating as if it is Anthony Richardson under center. It does seem like he is likely going to be the one that goes this week. If that changes and Joe Flacco is the one throwing the footballs, I do think that Michael Pittman needs to go up my rankings a little bit more, but keep in mind this is with Anthony Richardson being the assumed starting quarterback here on Sunday. Now coming in at my wide receiver 30, I do have Dontavion Wicks for the Green Bay Packers. Like I mentioned, they get to play against the Los Angeles Rams, and Wicks, he brought in 5 of 13 targets for 78 yards and 2 touchdowns in the Packers' 31-29 loss to the Vikings on Sunday. Wicks, he was filling in for Christian Watson, who did go down with a high ankle sprain, and he should be filling in for him as the starter here for the next few weeks. Wicks is a player that I'm instantly comfortable starting this week if you picked him up off of the waiver wire, especially in a matchup against a weak Rams secondary that currently ranks 27th against opposing wide receivers. And now the last player in this tier for me, it is going to be Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. As I mentioned, they play the Indianapolis Colts, and Kirk, he caught 7 of 12 targets for 61 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 24-20 loss to the Texans. It was a really rocky start for Christian Kirk to start the year, but back-to-back top 25 finishes at the wide receiver position make him a player that I think we can continue to play moving forward, especially in positive matchups like this one. One thing that worries me a little bit is the fact that the production for Christian Kirk has come with Evan Engram off of the football field, so this is definitely something I'm going to be paying attention to moving forward. And now moving on to my tier 7, my last tier, we're going to call these the low-end wide receiver 3s. Coming in as my wide receiver 32, I do have Jerry Jeudy of the Cleveland Browns. He gets a matchup against the Washington Commanders. Now Jeudy, he turned 9 targets into 6 receptions for 72 yards in Sunday's 20-16 loss to the Las Vegas Raiders. Jerry Jeudy, he was the leading receiver for the Browns in this one, and that's not the first time that has happened this year. The way he's been playing, he should be considered a good, not great wide receiver 3, but the matchup makes him playable here this week for sure. Now coming in at my wide receiver 33, I am going to put Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. He gets a matchup against the New Orleans Saints this week, and Worthy recorded 3 catches on 4 targets for 73 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 17-10 win over the Chargers. With Rashee Rice out for who knows how long now, going to be up to Kelsey and Xavier Worthy to fill in the production in the meantime. Worthy is going to have the opportunity to prove his first-round draft capital very quickly now, and he should be the default wide receiver 1 on the Chiefs offense, but he is still a boom-bust play at best. Now speaking of boom-bust plays, let's talk about wide receiver 34. I do have Rashid Shaheed. He plays against the Kansas City Chiefs, and that said, Shaheed, he caught 8 of 11 targets for 83 yards, and he added 14 rushing yards on 2 carries in Sunday's 26-24 loss to the Falcons. Shaheed, he saw a season high in targets last week, and he nearly matched Chris Olave's production, and there is no question that he's a full-time player in this offense with big play ability, but this week's matchup against Kansas City, it might be the toughest test that he's seen so far this season. Now moving on to my wide receiver 35, I do have Darnell Mooney of the Atlanta Falcons. They play against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and Mooney, he caught 3 of 6 targets for 56 yards during Sunday's 26-24 win over the Saints. Mooney, he looks like the number 2 receiving option in this offense behind only Drake London. He doesn't have much touchdown potential and only 1 red zone target in the last month of games, but he is seeing enough volume that I think he can be used in fantasy football if you need him. However, this week's matchup against Tampa Bay, it is pretty tough on paper. And now my last and final wide receiver here in tier 7, wide receiver 36, I got Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. They play against the Las Vegas Raiders, and Sutton, he caught 3 passes for 60 yards and 1 touchdown on 9 targets against the Jets on Sunday. Sutton, he is one of the few options in Denver that I think we can even consider playing at this point. The QB play, it hasn't been great, but Sutton, he's getting the targets, and the quality just isn't great with those targets. He's still a player that I think is going to be inconsistent. He really won't give you too much unless he gets into the end zone, but if you need him this week, he's still a wide receiver 3. So there you have it. That's my top 36 wide receivers as of this moment as we head into week 5 of the NFL season. If you did enjoy the video, make sure you hit the like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. Also, make sure you are subscribed. That way you can catch the running back version of this episode as it comes out later today on the channel. I don't want you to miss that one. And last but not least, if you want updated rankings throughout the week, help with your start-sit decisions, waivers, trades, any of that stuff, make sure you go join my Discord. I do have a free Discord linked in the description, and as I mentioned, it's free to join. There is no risk in doing that, so make sure you go join that Discord. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.